Good afternoon to you, Attorney Richard Rogers.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me.
I hope you are doing well, and it's good to see you again after so many years since we met in the Washington, D.C. area. And
And I'd just like to say to begin with that I lived in Cambodia for 5 years. They were wonderful years, and I read the Cambodia Daily religiously. So, because the Cambodia Daily spoke truth to power, it was kicked out of Cambodia. And sadly, we're seeing more and more of that manipulation of the media. So I'm glad you're still going.
Right.
Abroad.
Thank you, Attorney Rogers. First, let me begin, and I would like to remind our audience that Cambodia has been plagued by land grabs and evictions for decades. Those believed to be directly, wholly, or partially involved in and responsible for their actions have not been brought to justice. Attorney Richard Rogers of Global Diligence law firm in 2017 filed suit at the International Criminal Court under the Rome Statute for crimes against humanity for all the actions that took place in Cambodia. Attorney Rogers, can you update our audience as well as your plaintiffs the status of the case at the International Criminal Court? How far has it been progress at this point?
Yeah, so thanks very much. First of all, I think if I could just outline what this case is really about.
Yes, please do.
This is about the Cambodian ruling elite who have created this autocratic system, this kleptocratic system, by manipulating and controlling the institutions that are meant to support the democracy in Cambodia. So they've gained effective control over civil service, over security forces, over the judges, over the media, and basically created this shadow state. And they've done this for one reason, and that is to self-enrich themselves. But of course, there's one small inconvenience for the ruling elite, which is the Cambodian people are in the way. And those are people that simply want to have a fair chance of making a living, that want to use their land and to use their resources that belong to them in order to support themselves and their families. Yeah. But of course, the ruling elite, on the other hand, wants to take those resources from the Cambodian people. So quite naturally, the people resist. They try and prevent their villages from being torn down. They try and prevent their land from being taken, from being deforested, etc. And then there's violence. So basically, the ruling elite have to commit terrible violence and terrible crimes in order to steal all those resources from the people. Now, this amounts to a crime against humanity, because a crime against humanity is where lots of crimes that are listed in the ICC statute are committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack against a civilian population. And that's exactly what's going on in Cambodia. So the crimes, for example, include forcible eviction, include murders, include illegal detentions and torture, etc. So although land grabbing itself is not a crime per se, the crimes associated with land grabbing are, and very much directly listed in the ICC statute. So I think there's three reasons why the ICC should prosecute this case, bearing in mind that there's lots of different situations around the world where there's mass human rights abuses. So the ICC has to choose. It can't do everything. But there's three reasons, and one is that the number of victims is so high. We estimate that up to 1 million people have been adversely affected by land grabbing one way or the other. Yeah. The second reason is that this land rush is a problem globally. So it's not just in Cambodia. In many, many parts of the world, this is a problem that ultimately leads to mass human rights abuses. And so if the ICC took a stand in Cambodia, opened a full investigation on the Cambodia situation, then that would also send a very important message to other countries around the world, to the leaders and to the business people. And I think the third reason why this is an important case for the ICC is because it fits into the ICC's own policy on case selection and prioritization. And that's a policy that the ICC prosecutor herself issued in 2016. And that policy says that when crimes that are within the Rome Statute are committed that involve forcible displacement of people, illegal resource exploitation, and environmental destruction, then those cases should be prioritized. Yeah. And the ICC prosecution has not followed a single case yet that fits into that policy. Yeah. And of course, the Cambodia case is a perfect fit because it involves massive amounts of forcible displacement. It involves terrible environmental destruction, and it's all about illegal resource exploitation. So I think there are many reasons why the ICC should move forward. Now, in terms of where the case is, it's been sitting there in the preliminary examination stage for several years, and that's the stage where the prosecutors assess, first of all, issues of jurisdiction. So does it fit within the timescale? And the answer is yes. Does it fit within the territory? And the answer is yes, because Cambodia has signed up to the ICC statute. Does it fit within the subject matter? This is a bit more tricky for the prosecutors because this Cambodia case deals with slightly unusual types of crimes. So you have to put the crimes together, and it's the cumulative effect of those crimes that matters. But clearly the answer is also yes. And so it's at that stage at the moment, and after that, the prosecutor will then see whether or not the crimes are being investigated and prosecuted in Cambodia, and of course they're not. And then she will see whether it's serious enough, and I think the answer must be yes, because there's simply so many victims. So we think we have a very strong case. And what happens internally is that the ICC prosecutors make an assessment that they've got to go through all the evidence to make sure it's genuine, to make sure what I've stated is accurate. And then it will go to the management of the prosecution's office. And then ultimately the prosecutor and her senior staff will decide whether or not this case fits into their own priorities. And what's interesting is that the prosecutor who's leaving in the summer and being replaced by a new one, she has said that she wants to deal with all the pending preliminary examinations before she leaves. And she specifically said she wants to deal with the Cambodia case. So we know that she intends to deal with this within the next few months. And so that's why we are having a sort of open letter campaign.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Attorney Rogers. At the initial filing, how many Cambodian victims in total were named as plaintiffs? Is this suit called a class action lawsuit?
Well, the ICC procedurally functions quite differently than national courts. Okay. So actually, they don't have class actions in the ICC. It's a criminal court and an international criminal court. Okay. And what happens is that people like myself, lawyers that represent victims or other civil society groups, can file on behalf of one or more people who are victims of crimes under the statute. Yeah. And when I filed, I rather than getting hundreds or thousands of plaintiffs, if you want to call it that, I got powers of attorney and statements from 10 representative victims. So these were the types of victims represented, the different types of victimization that were going on in Cambodia. Yeah. So although there's only 10 victims that gave me a power of attorney, in fact, the case represents hundreds, thousands and thousands of Cambodians, because it deals with a massive system, a criminal system that commits crimes against thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of people.
Yes, almost a million from the report I get collected from different non-governmental organizations. Is there an estimated time frame for how long the prosecution office would consider taking action to investigate the allegations from the time the information was submitted?
No, unfortunately, there's no time limit. We had hoped, obviously, it would be much quicker. And just as we think that it's about to go forward, then something else happens, like the situation in Afghanistan or in Palestine, and the ICC only has so many resources and has to put resources on another situation. So there is no particular limit. Some cases move quickly, other cases move slowly. This case, unfortunately, has moved rather slowly. But as I said, we're going to know one way or the other in the next few months, whether it goes forward or whether it stays on the back burner.
Yeah. When we hear the term crimes against humanity, we think of gross human rights violations, not just non-feasance, misfeasance or malfeasance, if I can use these legal terms. Is Hun Sen sued as head of government? The government of Hun Sen is sued as a whole, not individually.
What the case chose to do is it chose to lay out this criminal system. So as I mentioned, this kleptocracy that had been created off the back of the Khmer Rouge period and all the insecurity that came with that. So it's not a case against an individual. Okay. Many people believe, understandably, that Hun Sen is as the sort of leader of this system, then he must hold some responsibility, some criminal responsibility for the crimes. But we didn't design the case just to go after Hun Sen. What we did is we outlined how the system works and how the system comes together to permeate all aspects of life in Cambodia, to commit mass crimes against the Cambodian people. And there are many, many different people involved in that, whether or not they are government officials who give the concessions, whether or not they are businesses who buy the concessions and cut down the trees and operate in Cambodia, or whether they're the security forces, the police, the military, who throw people off their land and burn the villages down. So those three categories of people are going to be responsible for the crimes. And it's for the ICC prosecutors to determine where the evidence leads them and who should be indicted. Okay.
Now, that's my next question. If I'm not mistaken, the suit ties, government officials, the generals, the armed forces under Prime Minister Hun Sen of Cambodia to land grabs and eviction that forced nearly 1 million people from their homes, their lands. Did you include in the suit other private entities, foreign and domestic, involved in the crimes as co-conspirators or as defendants?
Absolutely. As I mentioned, you need all these three different forces. You need the government people, you need the business people, you need the security people. It can't happen without any one of those. So all of those should be in the sights of the ICC prosecutor if and when she moves forward. And what we've seen is that the businesses that are involved in the land grabbing tend to be partly Cambodian owned by people connected with the CPP and partly foreign owned who bring in the money and the resources. So this is just simply another way for the ruling elite to get rich by making sure that the foreign companies collaborate and partner with local oligarchs, and they take a percentage of the profits.
Okay. When you briefed the Cambodian American community in the Washington, D.C. area some 5 years ago, I asked you this question as a private citizen. Who is going to enforce the court's ruling if Hun Sen and associates are indicted? How will they be brought to stand trial? And how will the victims from his crimes be paid restitution?
Well, the ICC has no police force. That's an inevitable weakness of an international court like this. So it relies on nation states helping it and implementing its requests, whether they're arrest warrants, indictments, etc., etc. And so enforcement, it is a real challenge if this nation state doesn't want to cooperate.
Yeah.
And since Hun Sen controls Cambodia, of course they won't want to cooperate. But that doesn't mean it won't be effective. And we've seen how effective it can be in other cases. If you take Sudan, for example, the ICC indicted President al-Bashir. And that ultimately, the effect of that was that he was isolated. He couldn't leave. He couldn't get any support from any international institutions. If he stepped foot out of Sudan, he was likely to be arrested with certain exceptions. And so what it does is that it sort of tightens the noose. And what we've seen is that serves as tremendous pressure on a state to start becoming a responsible citizen in the world, and to hand over those people who the ICC has indicted. Now, whether or not that happens in Cambodia, I think depends very largely on who they indict. But for that, we have to wait and see.
Okay. So the prosecution's office is going to decide which group of people, bad actors, are going to be indicted. So I can imagine from what you're describing, this lawsuit involves a lot of people. I'm not talking about the victims in the hundreds of thousands of people, but about the perpetrators. The perpetrators include civilian officials from different ministries, and also generals from the armed forces, and also business people, local people, and also foreigners. So if they are all indicted, how would you bring them, to where are you going to lock them up?
Well, what the ICC tends to do with its limited resources is to pick a few key people who they think are most responsible for the crime. So that would be people involved in the policy, or people involved sort of at the head of the security services that are involved in the violent crimes, or maybe business people who have been complicit in the crimes in various different places. So the ICC will have to have a look at the evidence to say, okay, which people are we going to indict? Where's the strongest evidence, and are they representative of the crimes? And then for the other people, all the other thousands of people who are somehow involved in crimes there, they will have to be tried either locally, which seems unlikely if the CPP remain in power, or in other countries if they go to other countries. Or they might be other forms of quasi-judicial remedies, such as individual targeted sanctions by government. So there's various different ways to try to bring justice and accountability.
Okay. Can the ICC go after Hun Sen's or his associates' banks accounts overseas?
Yes, they can.
It's possible. They can.
Yes. Indeed, they have the power to request certain states to freeze assets. And again, I should stress that we're not at the stage yet where the ICC either has said it's going to go forward with this case, or who they're going to indict. So we're hoping to get those decisions, certainly the first decision about whether to move forward to a full investigation. We're hoping to get that decision within a few months, and then we can start looking at who might they indict.
Okay, this is my last question, and I'll give you a few minutes if you have anything else to add. Supporters of social environmental union activists such as Kamlay, Chudvuthi, Chia Vichia, who were murdered, and supporters of opposition leader Sam Rangsi, who was forced into exile by threats and intimidations and harassments of all kinds, asked the following question: can the families of the victims who now live in Australia, some of them live in Australia, some of them live in Finland, and some of them live in France, file suit against Hun Sen and his government with the governments in their respective countries?
Well, the answer to that is quite complicated, and that's because it depends on the facts of the case, so the nature of the crime, and it depends on the country where they are. Because what has to happen is that the local prosecutors and judges have to find a way for them to have jurisdiction. So that means they have a legal right to prosecute the case. And because the crimes happened in Cambodia, it's not obvious that third states have a right to try those crimes. It depends on the facts of the case. Now, if it's a case of torture, that carries universal jurisdiction. So countries should be able to prosecute a case of torture within their own country if a case is filed. If it's a case of murder, unfortunately, it's not necessarily a situation where universal jurisdiction would apply. So they have to go and meet with the prosecutors locally and ask them if there's any way that the local courts will take on jurisdiction. And I should say that there is a campaign, the impunity campaign, that's been run by activists like Musaku and others, who are trying to do just this. They're trying to give support to the victims of people who have been assassinated in Cambodia and try to find ways to bring accountability in these courts where the families have fled.
Okay, now your last thought. A few minutes. Anything else you'd like to add?
I mean, the only thing I would add is that because the prosecutor said recently that she is going to decide one way or another on the Cambodian case within the next few months, so we're going to send her an open letter. Global Witness, Climate Council, which is my NGO, and FIDH, which is a huge French-based human rights organization. And we're going to send her an open letter encouraging her to open this case and pointing out how important this case is, not just for the Cambodian people, but also for environmental issues, because this case really involves destruction of the environment, stealing of land, illegal use of resources. And so it'll be incredibly powerful if the ICC accepted that this case amounts to crimes against humanity, because then it would open the door to other cases that involve massive environmental destruction. And we found that we got a huge number of very senior people to sign on to this letter in support. So that will be issued on Tuesday, and you will be able to see the level of support that this case has from around the world, not just in Southeast Asia, not just in Europe, South America, North America, Africa, etc.
Can you forward a copy to us so we can air it at some point, sometime this week or next week? Now, a question from our viewer and listeners: any idea what the Cambodian communities abroad in the United States or Europe or Australia can do to help the cause? Whatever you are trying to do here in your letter.
I think already there are several groups who have signed on to this letter, and that's crucially important, because that shows that this is not just about the 10 individuals who I represent. This is about the Cambodian community generally, who wants to see some level of accountability for the crimes in Cambodia. So those groups have already signed on to this letter. If there are more groups out there who have not, then please contact me and let me know, and we can add your support to the letter. But we don't need actual individuals' names. We need sort of communities, organizations.
Okay, thank you very much, Attorney Richard Rogers, lead counsel for the Cambodian plaintiffs, victims of the land grabs and evictions. Thank you for making the time for us today, and we hope to hear from you sometime soon. Please come back. Yes. All right.
Thank you very much for having me.
Have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.